Some of you know that I have been in Iowa City for a couple days this week taking care of my son Peter, who had surgery on Wednesday to repair the ACL of his right knee. And Peter's doing well, and he will heal, and anybody who's been through it knows that it's just painful at first and it takes a lot of therapy, but he'll get there. As I took care of him, I recalled the many injuries that Peter has had as he has played sports during high school and college. He is a young man who loves sports, and unfortunately, his body just has not cooperated. He also was hospitalized in high school with viral encephalitis, and so Peter's had some tough stuff to deal with, which, as you and I know, this is life. In this imperfect world in which we live with our finite bodies, it seems that in one way or another, we all kind of take turns dealing with the tough stuff of life in one way or another. When painful things happen, when we are going through bad times, we struggle to try to make sense out of what seems completely senseless. And people do that in a variety of ways. And as I name some of these ways, they'll be familiar to you. You've heard them before. You may have even thought in this way before about God's role in pain and suffering. We have heard people at funerals say to those who are grieving, this is God's plan, this is God's will. God has a purpose in this. God doesn't give you any more than you can bear. God took this person because God needed this person in heaven. Sometimes in the face of great pain in our own lives, we feel abandoned by God. And it's so easy for us to move to a place not only of feeling abandoned, but that we're being punished by God. That there must be something that we have done, some horrible sin, that God has meted out this kind of punishment in our lives. And sometimes when horrible things take place on the world stage, like Hurricane Katrina or the earthquake in Haiti, there will be those who speak up and say that this kind of horrific human suffering and tragedy happened because God is punishing these people for their evil, for their sin. And those voices that claim God's punishment hurt our hearts as we look at the depth of pain that people are dealing with. Sometimes in our efforts to try to understand God's role in the unfolding of human history, we claim God's authority in ways that make all of human history look like it's been predetermined, which of course makes us puppets on a string without say in the unfolding events of our lives or human history. And we can take it to extremes as we picture God, as Adam Hamilton says, as supreme micromanager, the one in charge of getting us little things like parking spaces and touchdowns, the one who is in charge of every single human cell and every single organism and is responsible for a cell going haywire and cancer happening. Or in our efforts to try to understand, we sometimes end up blaming God for choices that we make and the consequences, the very painful consequences that sometimes we bear. One example that comes to me is when someone chooses to drive after consuming alcohol. And sometimes, instead of seeing a horrific accident as a result of that decision, we invoke God's name as the cause of that pain, which of course lets us off the hook, but indicts God in a way that I believe is not accurate. And so we struggle to explain the things that happen in the unfolding of our lives and the unfolding of human history. We struggle to understand where God is in the midst of pain and suffering. Probably the greatest challenge to our faith is to try to reconcile a God of love with the suffering that we experience and the suffering that we see all around us in the world. These are questions that humankind has wrestled with from the beginning of time. And I'm here to tell you that there is no way in one sermon on one day I'm going to wrap it all up in a nice, neat package and hand to you an understanding of God in the midst of human suffering. Books and books and books have been written on this topic. There's even a name for this effort of understanding where God is in suffering. It's called theodicy. And there is much that can be said, and what I'm going to say today, you may not even agree with, and that's okay. What I'm sharing with you today is how I understand God in the midst of suffering, but also to say, I certainly don't have all the answers. As I think about this issue, for me, a lot of it comes down to who is God and what is God's character? What is God's nature? It is very understanding that we would think of God as harsh and punishing, particularly when it comes to sin. The reason is that in our Old Testament readings, particularly in the writings of the prophets, over and over and over, we hear how the people disobeyed God and therefore they are being punished by God. These writers are dealing with this situation in history. They understand that the Hebrew people are God's chosen people, not chosen to lord it over others, but chosen to bring God's light into the world. And here they are, and they are being oppressed. The northern kingdom fell to Assyria in the 8th century BCE, and the southern kingdom fell to Babylon in the 6th century BCE. And so the prophets and the writers in the Old Testament are saying, how can it be that as God's chosen people, we're suffering in this way? How can it be that as God's chosen people, we have been taken over and oppressed by other countries, other nations? And so the answer that they come up with is this: this would only have happened if we had been disobedient. This can only happen because God is punishing us for our disobedience. And so you and I have heard over and over and over that that is how God works. There is one book in the Old Testament, though, that is written to counteract that understanding of God, and it is the book of Job. If you are familiar with the story of Job, you know that Job was an upright man who found favor in God's eyes. And Job had wealth, and Job had a big family, and Job had his health. And overnight, he loses everything. He loses his wealth, he loses his children, he loses his health. And we find Job sitting on an ash heap, scraping his sores with a shard of pottery. He still has his wife, but she's making him miserable in what she has to say to him. Job's 3 friends show up. And initially, they come and they sit with him in his pain. They sit with him in a world that you could call the land of no answers. Then they start to give him answers. Whether it's out of a sense of helplessness on the part of the friends, whether it's simply trying to make sense of the senseless, they start to give Job answers. And they tell Job that it's clear that he has sinned in some way. They tell Job all he needs to do is ask forgiveness from God. They tell Job that this would not be happening to him if he had not done something wrong in the sight of God. And if you have read this book, you know that over and over and over, these three well-meaning friends are saying to Job, you have messed up big time, buddy. Come clean. Tell God. None of this would have happened if you had gotten it right. And over and over and over in the book of Job, Job is saying to his friends, no, that's not it. And over and over and over, Job is ranting and raving and screaming and shouting at God, wanting answers, telling God how unfair this is, telling God on no uncertain terms exactly how Job thinks and feels about the situation that he has found himself in. At the end of the book of Job, God finally speaks. God doesn't give answers. What God does is invite Job into the mystery of God, but then God says something really important that you and I need to hear today. God condemns Job's three friends. You see, Christians get it wrong. When we tell others that their suffering is because of God. And particularly we Christians get it wrong when we tell others that God is punishing them because of their sins. In fact, God is saying in the book of Job that in and of itself is sinful. But God doesn't stop there. God commends Job for his faithfulness. Do you realize what that means? It is faithful to cry out to God, to rant, to rave, to scream, to shout, to tell God exactly how we feel about what is happening in our lives, that is an act of faith. In our tradition, it's called a lament. And if Job's lament is not enough for you to believe that that's a good thing to do, start reading the Psalms, because over and over and over, you hear the psalmist lamenting to God on no uncertain terms. And in Paul's writing in the book of Romans, centuries after Job, Paul reminds us that the Spirit intercedes for us with sighs too deep for words. It is an act of faith to talk to God with complete honesty in the midst of our pain and our suffering. And Job is faithful because he has endured. He has been willing to sit in the pain and in the mystery.